We ended with the time in Samuel where Samuel has been confirmed as a prophet of the Lord, and he's prophesied against Eli's families. And so we move into chapter 4. And in chapter 4, we see the prophecy that he spoke coming to pass. And so we'll pick it up in verse 19 of chapter 4. And what's happened now is the Philistines have attacked Israel. It's a bad time in Israel because Israel has been disobedient to the Lord. And so anytime there was disobedience in the country, they suffer the consequences. And in verse 19 we say, now his daughter-in-law, Phinehas' wife, so it's Eli's daughter-in-law, Phinehas is one of the sons, Phinehas and Hophni, was pregnant and about to give birth. And when she heard the news that the ark of God was taken, so the Philistines had attacked and they had taken the ark of the covenant, not Noah's ark. People get looking at the Bible, sometimes get a little confused here when they talk about ark. This is the Ark of the Covenant where the Ten Commandments were contained. When she heard that the Ark of God was taken and that her father-in-law and her husband had died, she kneeled down and gave birth, for her pains came upon her. And about the time of her death, the woman who stood by her said to her, do not be afraid, for you have given birth to a son. But she did not answer or pay attention. She called the boy Ichabod, saying, the glory has departed from Israel, because the ark of God was taken and because of her father-in-law and her husband. And she said, the glory has departed from Israel, for the ark of God was taken. So it's a horrible time in the history of Israel. God's presence, represented in the ark, has left the country. It's gone. And so Phinehas' wife has a baby, and as it's being born, she says she's going to call the baby Ichabod. What a great name to grow up with. The glory has departed. How would you like to be called Ichabod? Not a real good name for anybody. So we see the ark is taken and it's in the land of the Philistines. And then this incredible story takes place in chapter 5. It says, then the Philistines, verse 2, then the Philistines took the ark of God and brought it to the house of Dagon and set it by Dagon. When the Ashdodites arose early the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the ark of the Lord. So they took Dagon and set him in his place again. So here's an interesting thing, even that the Philistines have to take their God, they gotta fix their God. I mean, their God doesn't fix them, they have to fix their God. Their God, Dagon, left in the same room with the Ark of the Covenant, actually falls down. And so they took him and set him back in his place. In verse 4, but when they arose early in the next morning, behold, Dagon had fallen on his face to the ground before the Ark of the Lord. So he falls down again. And the head of Dagon and both the palms of his hands were cut off on the threshold. Only the trunk of Dagon was left to him. So they're losing, their God, which is just this idol. He's just falling apart. First day he falls down, they have to pick him up, set him back up. Next day he falls down, he loses his head. Don't lose your head over this thing. Well, he lost his head, and his palms were broken off. So he's laying on the ground all broken up. And so they're not liking this too much. So in verse 11 it says, they sent therefore and gathered all the lords of the Philistines and said, send away the ark of God of Israel, and let it return to its own place, that it may not kill us and our people. For there was a deadly confusion throughout the city. The hand of God was very heavy there. It's interesting, the presence of the Lord among the obedient brings great blessing. The presence of the Lord among the disobedient brings great judgment. And those that don't follow him, the same presence of the Lord, the purity and power of the Lord, given the setting, has quite a different effect. There was a friend of mine that talked about a revival that took place in Minnesota among the Native Americans up there. And he said during one particular meeting this night, the presence of the Lord was so strong in the place. I might have already told this once, but it was so strong in that place, said it had this effect. The people of God that were submitted to the Lord all bowed down. Everyone was like falling on their face on the floor, just worshiping the Lord. There were some that weren't committed to the Lord, but it moved their hearts so much they ran forward to the altar and gave their lives to Jesus. But he said there was one person there that was just so hard-hearted. When that presence of the Lord was so strong, they took off and they ran out the back door, just out into the darkness. It was kind of a prophetic picture of what happens when the presence of God comes. Those that love him worship him. Those that are on the brink, on the border, they really come into his into obedience to him. And those that are just hard-hearted and just aren't going to submit, they have to flee. They have to get out of they run into the darkness. And it says, then the men who did not die were smitten, the Ashdodites there that had taken the ark into their community. And when they did not die, they were smitten with tumors in the city, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. So everyone that was left in this town, their God falls down. He's all broken up. He loses his head. He breaks his palms. They get him out. They want to get the ark of God back to where it belongs, because it's destroying them, to the effect that all of a sudden a plague breaks out, and they're all afflicted with tumors. In fact, the King James, I think, says emerods, which, we've got different ideas what that might be. But anyway, there's an outbreak of disease that happens among them just because the presence of the Lord is there among actually the disobedient. So the ark returns, we see from that. The Philistines send it, and you can read those stories, really wonderful stories in 1 Samuel. And the ministry of Samuel increases, and Samuel arises in esteem in the eyes of all the people. But then in chapter 8, verse 7, there's a new thing that happens. And the Lord said to Samuel, "Listen to the voice of the people in regard to all that they say to you." And what they're saying is, we want a king. We want a king. We want to be like all the other nations. Here they've had a special relationship with God, where God was going to be their king personally, and just over each family, God would, he would have a relationship with each family. Well, here, no, we want a king. We want someone to lead us, not God. And so God says to Samuel, "And listen to all that the people say, for they have not rejected you, but they have rejected me from being king over them. Like all the deeds which they have done since the day that I brought them up from Egypt, even to this day, in that they have forsaken me and served other gods, so they are doing to you also. Now then, listen to their voice. However, you shall solemnly warn them and tell them of the procedure of the king who will reign over them." So he says, listen to what they say. They want a king. I'm going to give them a king, but tell them what will happen when they have a king. The king's going to require you to pay taxes that you haven't been paying. The king's going to take some of your sons and put them into the military, and they'll have to work for you. The king's going to do all of these things as a leader of the land, which is going to be hard on you as a people. But what Samuel was dealing with is, he was dealing with his own personal rejection, that they were rejecting him. But the Lord says, no, they're not rejecting you. They're rejecting me. So he says, do what they say. So God chooses a king for them, Saul, and Samuel anoints him. But what the story that we have first is Saul is in search of his dad's donkeys. His dad's donkeys get loose, and they're wandering around, and they can't find the donkeys. And they're wandering around the land trying to find these escaped donkeys. Then they decide, hey, let's go find the seer, which in those days it says a prophet was called a seer. And so they go find the seer, and it's Samuel. And they're looking for a word from the Lord from Samuel as to where the donkeys are at. Well, they finally find Samuel, and they get a word. But here's the word, and it's a little different than Saul was expecting. It says, now in verse 15 of chapter 9, now a day before Saul's coming, the Lord had revealed this to Samuel, saying, about this time tomorrow I will send you a man from the land of Benjamin. You shall anoint him to be prince over my people Israel, and he shall deliver my people from the hand of the Philistines. For I have regarded my people because their cry has come to me. When Samuel saw Saul, the Lord said to him, behold, the man of whom I spoke to you, this one shall rule over my people. So here they're looking for a word from Samuel about where are the donkeys. They're going to find Samuel, and the word that they're going to get from Samuel is, you're going to be king. You're going to be the ruler over the people. This is quite a different thing than what they were expecting. So we get in here, and it says in chapter 10, verse 1, then Samuel took the flask of oil, poured it on his head, kissed him, and said, has not the Lord anointed you a ruler over his inheritance? So Samuel actually anoints Saul as the first king in Israel. We've now moved into the era of the kings. We're moving out of the judges, the era of the judges. We're moving into the era of the kings. Saul is the first king. He's going to start out with a glorious beginning. Unfortunately, there's so many kings in the history of Israel and Judah after they split. Many of them start out with a really good start, but they just don't follow through very well. And unfortunately, we're going to see that happens to Saul.